The government has announced a new tax on housing. It's aimed at foreign investors. It's set to raise billions of dollars if, of course, some of the forecasts come true. What it will do is mean foreign investors are further encouraged to only buy new housing, and if they leave a property vacant, they'll be taxed for the privilege. Joining me now is Shadow Housing Minister Michael Sukkar. Thanks for your time. What do you make of these changes? I know they're not going to shift the dial in a massive way, but every little bit helps in this area. Do you approve of what's happening here?
Look, Tom, I think the truth is this is too little too late from this government. The problem is they have presided over record levels of migration. I mean, the largest migration we've ever seen in a single year. And at the same time, they've presided over falling housing approvals, falling new homes being built, falling first home buyers. So this is really trifling at the edges. We'll reserve our judgment on this on a couple of factors. Firstly, will it be enforced? And, are the numbers here so tiny that it's quite disproportionate to the announcement that's been made? And I suspect that's the case. In the end, if you want to improve housing affordability at present, you need to run a planned migration program that ensures that infrastructure, and I think housing is the most important form of social infrastructure, is able to keep up with the levels of migration. And this year,
we'll get to migration in a moment.
Sure.
Yeah, we'll get to migration in a moment. But just on this element, let me come at it another way. Is there anything you disagree with or oppose from what was announced?
Not really. We think what they've proposed looks fine. But again, it's just so tiny. It doesn't move the dial, Tom. So it's hard to object to because it's so irrelevant. But the problem here is, and where I get quite frustrated from this government, is that they're trifling on the edges and forgetting the main game here. And they've really got to answer to the Australian people why this year alone they're bringing in 520,000 people when we're only building 175,000 homes. They still haven't answered that question. And until they accept that they've made a catastrophic error there, these sorts of things are really just window dressing.
I am moving on to that. I've got one more for you, though, on the housing aspect. So you say this is too small to shift the dial. What about what is essentially more up to the states, but bigger in this area? Some form of tax on vacant properties for those who own them domestically, Australian citizens. Victoria has moved in this direction. Would that shift the dial more? Is that a good idea?
Well, it's not. In the end, the way you treat foreign investors who own properties, I have no issue with that being quite different from Australians. In the end, we think property rights should be protected. But as for foreign investors, there are, as you say, Tom, there are already vacancy penalties in the form of taxes in some jurisdictions. They're not being enforced. I can tell you right now, in a number of local municipalities, we've got really good evidence to suggest that there are, in some cases, hundreds of properties that are empty, and yet the vacancy taxes that are being applied are only being applied to a tiny proportion of those. So one of the reasons why we'll reserve judgment on this, Tom, is it's not the media release or the headline or the glib words from the Treasurer, but can they actually enforce these things? And to the extent they can, we've got no issue with it. But let's focus on the main game, I think. And I think
let's talk about migration. So you say there's no planned migration system. I mean, the government has essentially been continuing on with what it inherited and what has been long in place in Australia. Demand-driven temporary migration is the one that's been rocketing up. So Labor hasn't done anything differently, has it? It's just we had a COVID pause and there was pent-up demand and that's increased. That's the reality of why that number, 500,000, is being hit.
Well, if the government's real claim here is, Tom, that they had nothing to do with the migration settings, and then why on earth are they there? They should hand over to a government that can do it. And the truth is, in government, the coalition reduced net overseas migration to 160,000. Part of that Yes, it was pre-COVID, I admit, but part of that was to ensure that our migration settings kept up with and were tied to things like infrastructure and housing. We created the population centre for the precise purpose of ensuring that our population was tied to those things that affect everyday Australians' lives, including housing.
Well, just on that though, 160,000 was the cap on permanent migration. That hasn't changed under Labor. What's behind this 510,000 is temporary migration. It's demand driven now, as in it can be as high as it wants, and it was demand driven when you were in office. That hasn't been a policy change. The figure driving this demand driven element was the same under your government.
Well, no, Tom. So the net overseas migration number was reduced under the former coalition government. So I accept your point, but the point I was making was there was a recognition from the former coalition government in lowering that permanent number that we did need to tie the level of migration to those sorts of things, including when I said we created the population centre. That was a really definite expression of the view of the government at the day, that you needed to ensure that those two things worked together, i.e. social infrastructure like housing and roads, schools and hospitals, and your migration settings. Now, the government's been in office for 18 months. If they're seriously suggesting to you, Tom, that they've not been able to do anything for 18 months, the 520,000 that the ABS has said we'll see this year has got nothing to do with them, then they're kidding you or they're kidding themselves. Governments of the day have to address the issues of the day, Tom. And when you've got first home buyers at records we haven't seen for over a decade, when you see new home starts down, new home builds down, rental vacancy rates at historically low levels and rents rising, the government can't be allowing 520,000 people to come in. And today's announcement that they're reducing migration, well, in the last budget, they said they'd have 1.5 million people over 5 years. Now they're saying it'll be 1.6 million over 5 years. That doesn't represent a cut in migration, in my view, Tom.
A change from the forecast, I believe. Anyway, we'll see what the Minister has to get up and say about it. Michael Sukkar, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Good on you, Tom. Thanks very much.